mandatory minimums, statutory maximums, and mechanisms for leniency. In federal sentencing, mandatory minimum and statutory maximum penalties play a critical role in determining the boundaries of a defendant's potential sentence. These penalties often stem from specific legislation aimed at deterring certain types of criminal activity or ensuring severe punishment for particularly egregious offenses. Mandatory minimums establish a fixed minimum sentence that a judge must impose for a specific crime, effectively limiting the judge's discretion in imposing a lesser sentence. Sometimes the guidelines recommend a sentence that is below a statutory mandatory minimum sentence. Regardless of the recommended guideline sentencing range, a court is required to impose a mandatory minimum sentence whenever it's applicable. In these instances, the recommended guidelines range will become the mandatory minimum sentence. Mandatory minimum sentences are often associated with drug crimes and are triggered based upon the drug in question, its purity and weight. Conversely, statutory maximums set an upper limit on the sentence that a judge may impose for a particular offense. Whenever the recommended guidelines exceed the statutory maximum penalty, the maximum penalty will become the recommended sentencing range. While these sentencing boundaries are generally rigid, certain mechanisms exist that empower courts to go below mandatory minimum sentences under specific circumstances. The safety valve. The safety valve provisions allow for a sentence below the mandatory minimum for certain non-violent, first-time drug offenders who meet specific criteria. This mechanism is designed to ensure that low-level, non-violent offenders are not subject to unduly harsh sentences. It is important to keep in mind that the mere possession of a firearm during the course of the offense will prohibit safety valve consideration. Additionally, there is a requirement that the accused sit down with investigating officers and provide a truthful explanation of their role in the prosecuted offense regardless if the defendant has entered into a cooperation agreement with the government. Substantial assistance. A court may impose a sentence below a mandatory minimum if the defendant provides substantial assistance to the government in the investigation or prosecution of another person involved in the offense or other known criminal activity. This reduction is granted at the request of the government, typically in the form of a motion, and the extent of the reduction depends on the nature, extent, and significance of the defendant's assistance. It should be noted that the court can honor the government's recommended reduction, award less than the recommended reduction, or grant the defendant additional leniency if it desires. In other words, the court is not bound by the government's recommendation even though it is required for it to act. By understanding the interplay between the federal sentencing guidelines, mandatory minimums, statutory maximums, and the mechanisms that allow for sentencing reductions, legal professionals can more effectively navigate the complexities of federal sentencing and advocate for their clients' best interests.